Hello, good day, everyone. I am here to provide a thorough discussion on impersonal communication theories of computer-mediated communication. Now, in the previous video lectures, I already had given introductory concepts pertaining to computer-mediated communication and its functions in society. This time, it's better to have a deep understanding of computer-mediated communication from various theories that we can use for us to intensify also our understanding of the various contexts of computer-mediated communication, tracing from history up to the present. So for the objectives in this discussion, first one is to define impersonal communications. I'll be providing a definition that will help us understand what impersonal communication is and what sets this apart or what sets this different from the other types of communication that we have. Second is to explain how impersonal communication could result using perspectives that consider computer-mediated communication as limiting the number of cues communicators can exchange, considering that computers are, in the first place, not considered as social actors. But later on, I'll be explaining further on this for us to better understand how computers can become social actors given the current context that we have. Third is to apply media richness theory to predict and explain media choice when communicating. And last is to discuss how anthropomorphization of technologies guides how people perceive and interact with computer-mediated communication tools. So let me begin by defining what impersonal communication is. This is a type of communication in which exchange between participants happens and it also facilitates communication, but actually does not allow the participants to form a meaningful relationship based on their individual selves, traits, and personalities. In short, impersonal communication suggests that communication happens, but there is no good relationship happening by showing like the true nature of the participants' selves and as well as their different traits, cultural background, profile, and even personalities. Now, in the early paradigms of computer-mediated communication research, the internet was not expected to facilitate the types of messages and content required for relational development because we know that the internet or computers were discovered primarily to have a specific purpose, and that is to simply relay messages that are text-based. There was no intention to have computers developed to facilitate relational development or to facilitate relationships in general. It was therefore largely ignored as a viable medium for communication worthy of investigation early in its development. And though CMC was perceived as an inadequate tool for interpersonal communication, scholars began looking at it in the mid-1970s as organizations and work groups began to use CMC in decision-making. This has been very apparent in certain stages where individuals or work groups use computer-mediated communication for them to come up with certain decisions that will definitely affect organizations or institutions, or to be specific, for example, in businesses, when people needed to communicate with one another within the organization to come up with big decisions. So they use computer-mediated communication and various channels. For example, rather than call all members together for a face-to-face meeting, an online discussion or yes or no indicator should or could help group members coordinate ideas and make decisions. And if you are to consider it nowadays or to put it in the context of modern technology, we already have, for example, Google Forms in which you could solicit for advice, or you could ask for the responses immediately of individuals by asking them to take yes or no or to share their answers to the Google form. CMC tools finally provided a nudge academics needed to take note of the growing field and begin to conduct research on how communicating online may influence the communication process. And this is why nowadays, there have been several research works conducted already focusing on the influence of computer-mediated communication on the communication process between the computer and the people, or people and people, using computer channels. So the first paradigm that I'd like to discuss is this cues filtered out, or the CFO. This paradigm or these earliest paradigm of online communication, the cues filtered out approach by Coleman and Marcus in 1987 simply suggested that CMC could not facilitate the cues necessary for interpersonal communication. Okay, when we talk about these different cues, these are the different elements that are present or evident when people communicate interpersonally. For example, person A and person B, when they communicate with each other, of course, there will be cues that will be very important, such as gestures, facial expressions, even the vocal variety, which could signal a different meaning from text to text, the atmosphere during the communication, the communicative sphere itself. So there are different cues that we need to consider. And CFO here highlights or interjects that computers cannot do or cannot make these different cues visible during an actual communication. CFO paradigm argues that because CMC inherently limits the amount of information and the number of cues that can be conveyed, computer-based communication is incapable of carrying the emotion and socialness necessary for a meaningful interpersonal exchange or relationship. Because we know that if it's face-to-face or physical conversation, if it's transactional, then there will really be this socialness. There is this socialization happening because you communicate personally with the person. And in this situation, common cues are very evident or prevalent. For example, those that I mentioned, the facial expressions when communicating, or making sure that you also supplement your words with your hand gestures or body movements. Things like this are considered as cues in communication. Now, the CFO paradigm has lost a lot of its luster. More on this in a moment, which I will be discussing in the next slides, with more recent theories, studies, and experiences clearly demonstrating that we can have meaningful interactions and relationships online. Now, CFO being a traditional belief or notion on what computer-mediated is and how communication evolves in the computer world is actually one manifestation of how different theories have also advanced the beliefs on the use of computer for communication purposes. Hence, there is a need to discuss the CFO approach for two reasons. First one, the CFO approach was critical both to establishing computer-mediated communication as a field of research and to beginning the careful scientific examination of the processes and effects of interacting online. Although cues filtered out or CFO paradigm lost its luster or shine in the field of computer-mediated communication because of the advancement of more theories, it is still important for us to talk about CFO because it actually provided the foundations, the impetus in the conduct of more studies or research in the field of computer-mediated communication. This prompted many scholars that since computers are not viable in terms of socialness, in terms of making these different cues or communicative cues evident during the communication process, then there were more reasons why computer-mediated communication researches need to be conducted. Now, the second reason is that although the CFO approach may not broadly describe many contemporary CMC tools, it still accurately describes some online contexts and experiences. So we cannot have a sweeping generalization here telling that since CFO has been debunked already by several theories, it's no longer usable. It is still usable in a way that it can still describe some online contexts and experiences, most especially for those types of communication in which there is no really proper communication or interaction rather, or there is no level of socialness at all. Another theory that I wish to discuss is the social presence theory. So if CFO has its own sets of beliefs, emphasizing that computers do not have that socialness in them. Now, it's also important to talk about one theory which will help us to better understand what computer-mediated communication is. One reason CFO theories predicted impersonal communication was its inability to facilitate socio-emotional cues as posited by social presence theory. Now, the concept of impersonal communication versus interpersonal communication emerged because of the CFO theories, which definitely predicted that there is this type of communication in which socio-emotional cues are not evident. So if you are to categorize interpersonal and intrapersonal communication where different cues are highly evident, thanks to the CFO theories, which allowed us to really realize that there is this type of communication called impersonal communication that is primarily characterized with the absence of the socio-emotional cues. Socio-emotional cues are the non-verbal and verbal indicators we have of a communicative partner's social presence, emotion, and interpersonal closeness. So these are things that should be observed when communicating with another person. These signals often take the form of gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice, your stance, eye contact, and even the proximity, your distance from the person whom you are conversing with. However, online technological limitations strip away most of these cues. So this is what social presence theory here emphasizes, that because of the online setup or because of the platform where computer-mediated communication is done, most of these cues are absent or are being stripped away from the context or the scenario. Because face-to-face communication allows a lot of modes through which a message can be sent, social presence theory suggests it is inherently a better way to communicate socio-emotional cues than CMC, which is limited to a basic text-based message. So the social presence theory here also emphasizes that social presence is indeed important when communicating with someone. And if you communicate using computer-based platforms, it will be very difficult because these socio-emotional cues will be stripped away from the picture. Personal or face-to-face communication is much better compared to the basic text-based messaging that is happening or that is being done in the context of computers. That is why social presence theory here advocates for the use of face-to-face communication so that there will really be an authentic communicative process happening between people, okay, or between two individuals who are conversing with each other. We also have this lack of social context cues hypothesis. So we have had a discussion on the CFO paradigm, and then the social presence theory. This time, let's understand CMC from the perspective of social context cues hypothesis. Now, a second reason CFO theories predicted impersonal communication was the inability of CMC channels to transmit social cues. So if we have social emotional cues, we also have these social cues, which are those contextual tips based on our environment, our relationship, and our communication partner that we use to navigate a relationship and anticipate the course of the communicative exchange. For example, the people surrounding you during a communication process, the environment, the different internal and external factors that could affect the way you communicate with the person. So the social context cues hypothesis tells us that these cues do not exist in a computer setup or in a computer setting because everything is already pre-planned, templated, formatted. That is why different social contexts or social cues are not evident in computer platforms. Because individuals were communicating with faceless others and without the benefit of social rules or expectations to guide exchanges, they were expected to be unable to assess the individual characteristics of others. And I think this is pretty true when you're communicating online. You cannot really see the facial expressions of a person. You cannot see the gestures being used when communicating with certain words. Okay? Leading individuals to become belligerent, selfish, resistant to influence, and disinterested in interpersonal affiliation. That is why if we notice, when interpersonal communication is happening using computer-based channels, it's very difficult for us to establish that it's indeed interpersonal communication because the feedback system may not be accurate. Okay? For example, the simple sending of a like in response to a message may not necessarily mean that there's an intended meaning behind the like, or it could just be out of respect, or it could be just out of formality to respond to something, but it does not necessarily mean that it's always affirmation. So there could be different pictures that we can look at. Due to computer-mediated communication's inability to transmit social cues and its lack of affordances to transmit social norms, the CFO paradigm predicted that individuals could at best maintain an impersonal relationship. So this is where, because interpersonal relationships are very impossible or are considered quite impossible to happen in a computer-based context, then we can say that there is this impersonal communication happening instead of the previous one that I mentioned, the interpersonal communication. So what's now the context or the state of CFO? Now, the CFO paradigm was the dominant ideology of CMC research for many years, and it actually guided many studies on the impacts of online communication on interpersonal and group communication processes. So that is how impactful this CFO paradigm was previously, most especially for scholars who conducted a study on CMC. However, since the mid-1980s, this CFO paradigm has been mostly shelved. In large part, it has been set aside not only because of the changes in the technologies available for communication, but also due to how individuals have learned and adapted to online communication. So nowadays, we know that many people have been adjusting very well already to different contexts and different communication channels. So if you use IG, for example, or if you use Facebook, or if you use Twitter, depending on what is the nature really of the communication itself, then the person using these different platforms already have the idea why they're using or why they're choosing such platforms. So there's always a reason behind for the use of such platforms. Now, it is important to note that though the CFO paradigm is not regularly used in modern studies and discussions of CMC, its echoes are still felt today. We still see elements of CFO applied to studies addressing the absence of some cues. Okay, for example, if you wish to conduct a study on the absence of facial expressions in doing messenger chats. Okay, so we can actually use CFO for us to better understand this context. Okay, and then most commonly cues related to identities such as demographic information or nuanced interpersonal characteristics. As we can choose to have a text-only, voice-only, or audiovisual communication session with someone, all via the same device or on the same system, how we choose to communicate via CMC can influence the cues filtered in and out. As such, CFO can still be brought to bear meaningfully in situations in which impersonal CMC processes occur. So that is why we cannot disregard CFO paradigm still, because it has always been beneficial in understanding communication processes or situations in which these social or socio-emotional cues are not present. So impersonal communication still has much value, and we use it in our daily lives. For example, when we take and place a dinner order, okay, when we talk with someone and we just give our answers for their questions, or when we get information about a client from a colleague, or when we make small talks with strangers about the weather, or when, for example, when you ask someone, what's the time now? Anong oras na ngayon? So that's an example of impersonal communication. Importantly, impersonal communication is not inherently bad or functionless because it's still extant in our society. It is simply not helpful when rich, emotional, interpersonal interactions with others is required or appropriate. So we cannot use impersonal communication if we are dealing with interpersonal interactions, or when we are dealing with these cues that are observably absent in impersonal communication situation or setup. Another interesting theory that we can visit is the media richness theory. As computer and internet use began to expand in the 1980s, it did so primarily in organizations, largely because of the internet's killer app, electronic mail or the email. Email allowed organizations to send messages and large amounts of data instantaneously around the globe or down the hall at no cost. So because of that, there has been this pre-identification of different proper platforms where messages could be channeled through. As more businesses and organizations used email, GDSSs, and file sharing, it became clear there were times certain media choices made more sense than others. For example, if I were in the context before, I would say, well, for this kind of message that is quite long, that needed attachment, and I could use email. But for messages or information that I need to relay and must be read physically by individuals, then I would have to make memoranda or letters. In 1986, Daft and Lengel forwarded media richness theory to explain why and when individuals select specific media tools to send specific messages and make particularly organizational decisions. For example, why do I choose this kind of platform over the other one? Or why do I prefer to use this one compared to other available platforms? There could be a reason behind. And that reason there will be primarily affected by the available media, okay, the different media that we could use in order for us to choose the best channel to communicate our message. Media richness theory suggests every medium can be considered either lean or rich based on its quality to carry socio-emotional message content. So when we talk about lean media, these are channels that are effective at transmitting raw data, but not a sense of the personality or presence of the message sender. For example, when you need a certain data, so you would ask a colleague or a workmate, and then you would tell that person, can you please send me an Excel file on this? So that person now sends an Excel file through email, right? So the Excel file there is considered a lean media, meaning it is something that is sent from a person, but the social presence of the person is not there. Okay? It is channeled through email or another, for example, computer platform. Now, in contrast, rich media are those media that provide many social cues and transmit a sense of social presence. For example, when there's a need for you to clarify about certain thing from that colleague, why are the data on this Excel inaccurate? So, for you to make sure that you would be really clarified regarding the inconsistencies on that Excel file, you can call for a Zoom meeting or a Google meeting. That way, you could have an interaction with the person, a thorough discussion, and at the same time, social presence is really evident. When, then, is it best to use a lean versus a rich medium? Now, to answer this question, MRT considers the type of information to be communicated. Well, it highly depends because if it's just data that you can send and can be scanned by the receiver, then you can use email as your platform or your channel. But if it needs furtherance, if it needs discussion or clarifications, then you need to have this virtual or social presence by using communication platforms such as Zoom, Google Meeting, or even video calling. So for us to better understand what MRT means, we can look at it from the perspective of uncertainty and equivocality. So here we can say that media richness theories reduce uncertainty and reduce equivocality. So when we talk about uncertainty in the context of MRT, this means concrete information in individuals needs to access specific information to make decisions. So just like what I mentioned a while ago, regarding the Excel file example, if I wanted to make a decision, but I could not have any strong basis, I would ask my colleague to send me that Excel file. So in that case, media richness theory here tells us that that channel we use, the email, plus the Excel file, reduce the uncertainty on my end being the person needing the data, okay? Or needing access to the data for me to create decisions that are safe and sound. On the other hand, reducing equivocality here, now in the context of equivocality, this actually is the ability of information to identify one option among several, all of which may be vague or nebulous. So this is when you clarify someone or clarify another person, and you would ask for which among these different options may be used. So that's one example that I mentioned a while ago regarding the Zoom teleconference or Google Meet, in which you would really need someone to talk with you and to discuss matters so that you can be clarified regarding some inconsistencies. For example, on that Excel file I mentioned a while ago. So here, we can understand that the right choice of communication channels or media will tell us that there could be accuracy in terms of the information or the data that we will be sending. And we need to consider always the type of message that we need to send or the type of media that we need to channel, because it will also impact the channel that we shall be choosing. Okay? If it's email, other platforms such as social media, or other systems. Now, take a look at this media richness theory and its application. Now, in this figure, you can see the different media that you can use in communicating. For example, you have rules and regulations, formal information systems, special reports, documents, planning, direct contact, integrator, or group meetings. Now, if you notice, this side of media here are considered rich personal media. Why? Because, for example, when you conduct group meetings, there is really richness because of course, you get to talk with one another and you get to discuss matters. On one hand, this one is less rich or impersonal media because if it's rules or if these are rules and regulations, for example, when you impose this, then the person would simply read it or be informed about it, but there's nothing like a sort of a discussion regarding the different rules and regulations. But overall here, we could notice that certain channels or media could, of course, lead to or result in equivocality deduction and uncertainty reduction. Okay? So here we obtain additional data. AC answers to explicit questions such as when there are rules and regulations, of course, you will be obtaining additional data. But here, for equivocality deduction, for example, when you conduct group meetings or when you have direct contact with the person concerned, then you get to clarify, reach agreement, and decide which questions to ask. Okay? Now, take a look at how computers act as social actors. Now, in this section of my discussion, I'll be talking about CASA, or computers as social actors. Another theory of impersonal communication is CASA, okay, which is also considered a paradigm, same as with CFO, which primarily addresses how people interact with computers. So this time, we'll be talking about the interaction between people or the users and the computers that they are using. The computers as social actors approach addresses how people relate with computers, to and with computers and technology as if they were real beings treating their interaction with technology almost as an interpersonal relationship. Okay? And here is the concept of anthropomorphizing, in which you think of an inanimate object as something person-like. Now, the best example to explain this is what I am currently doing. I'm doing my lecture, I am pre-recording this one, but I am not doing the lecture virtually, in front of my audience or my students. That means I'm imagining that the person I'm talking to is right in front of me, but it's just in the form of my laptop. So I am giving attributes, human attributes to my laptop, imagining that I'm actually talking to a person and not a gadget or technology. So this is an example of computers as social actors, or this is covered under this paradigm, emphasizing that humans treat computers like humans too, as if they're conversing with actual individuals, as if they're transacting with a person behind the camera or behind the video or behind the audio, as if they're really having this interpersonal relationship with the computer. Here, our understanding of how computers work or function as social actors will be deepened by looking at different types of CASA, okay, or computers as social actors. Now, the computers as social actors theory comes from researchers at Stanford University who argued that people's interactions with computers are inherently social. This means to say that CASA here advocates for the belief that there is really social interaction happening between the computers and the people using them. This is not to say that people think computers are living things. Indeed, studies repeatedly acknowledge people are aware that computers are not living, animate things with which they can interact. However, even a series of programs and algorithms, computers and technologies can fulfill the functions necessary for fundamental models of communication. For example, when it's transactional, I, the person in the computer that I'm using to interact with, let's say I send a message to the computer responds to me. So that means the basic elements that must be present in a communication cycle are there. So we can say that interacting or communicating with a computer is still a social process because there is interaction happening, okay? Transactions happening. So this is the transactional model of communication, which suggests communicators serve as both message senders and receivers at the same time. However, the argument here is that in the context of computers and people's conversations or communication or transaction, we could say here that both sides are actually encoders, interpreters, and decoders. So this is transactional. So for example, if a person sends a message to the computer, so the message being sent is here, and then the computer here is both an encoder and a decoder, at the same time an interpreter, because there are certain algorithms that will already understand human responses or human texts. And then the computer responses in the form of a message as well, and then the person who sent the original message will now decode the feedback provided by the computer. So there is really a social interaction happening between the computer and the person. Now, onto the different types of CASAs. So we have here textual, virtual, and behavioral. Now, when we talk about textual CASA, Just the words a computer program uses can influence the way a person thinks, feels, or behaves simply based on how human the program is perceived. Now, try to imagine it. Before, computers were just considered as devices in sending messages, right? But nowadays, computers have not really fully evolved yet to cater to all needs of humans. Well, you could research on something, you could transact online, you could shop online, but there are also limitations. Same as the context before. Before, text-based messages were the primary messages channeled through computers, but it has evolved nowadays already. Now, textual CASA here emphasizes that text-based communication happens in virtual platforms or on various types of computers. Okay? Now, if we have to contrast this one with virtual CASA, we even experience interaction with virtual agents. Okay? However, the reality is that we're not actually interacting with people. For example, when there are avatars in front of us or on the screen, or when there are people with audio telling us what to do next or instructing us what will happen next, we're not actually interacting with people unless we are sure that we are communicating with an actual person if we see it on the video or on camera. Otherwise, we are just talking with virtual agents. And these virtual agents are oftentimes automated avatars. So it's already system generated in which responses are just sent to the person interacting with the computer. So the use of avatars or graphic representations become very helpful in this context. Now, the third type of CASA is behavioral CASA. Now, this part here tells us that the way computers react or interact with us could also have an impact on our behavior. For example, when we watch YouTube videos, let's say tutorials, we know that some tutorials are done not only physically by people, but also by some avatars, by some animations or cartoons, right? Now, these cartoons or avatars also produce facial expressions. They even use hand gestures when communicating. How do we feel or how do we react to these situations in which we are actually conversing or communicating or transacting with avatars or graphic animations? Now, contrast it when you actually communicate with someone, really a person. There's really a big difference. So behavioral CASA here tells us that the use of emotions and gestures in virtual or digital communication can actually impact our behavior as computer users. Okay, so those are the important theories that we need to understand when we talk about impersonal communication. And in the context of computer-mediated communication, these various theories are very instrumental for us to create a deep knowledge of how CMC functions and how it becomes very primordial or integral in the context of communication, may it be linear, transactional, interpersonal, or impersonal. Now, it is important to note that impersonal approaches do not inherently mean CMC cannot facilitate a socio-emotional friendly relationship. Well, the CFO perspective tried to, but this is why it has fallen into disuse. No? We cannot really think that all computers cannot do all human mechanisms. Well, there might be some limitations, but we cannot be conclusive that computers cannot do human job or human activities. They can still do because they are automated. They are systematized. They are actually generated in a way that they could do human functions. Although early research into CMC operated under the assumption that online communication could inherently never facilitate interpersonal communication, CFO has been generally discredited and subsequent theories have developed using assumptions like when specific media tools are used or MRT, then the resultant communication may be impersonal. So we need to understand also that impersonal communication exists in society. So sometimes we think that it's interpersonal because you're talking with another person or you're conversing with another person, but is there enough interaction? Are social, emotional, and social cues present in the communication process? Otherwise, communication is not interpersonal, but impersonal. Communication is not inherently impersonal or interpersonal. It highly depends on how you and the people you interact with communicate, online just as much as offline. So we cannot automatically say this is impersonal or this is interpersonal. We also need to understand the type of message, the context, and the presence of different cues in the communicative event. Okay? I hope I have fully explained everything and that you have understood very clearly all the concepts I discussed in this video discussion. So if you have any questions, you may comment down below or you may post this on the open forum. Thank you very much for watching my video lecture.